ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ಜೈ ಭೀಮ್. ಇವತ್ತು ಬಿಕಮಿಂಗ್ ಬಾಬಾ ಸಾಹೇಬ್ ಪುಸ್ತಕದ ಕುರಿತು ಪುಸ್ತಕದ ಲೇಖಕರಾದಂಥ ಆಕಾಶ್ ಸಿಂಗ್ ರಾಥೋರ್ ಅವ್ರ ಜೊತೆ ಒಂದು ಚರ್ಚೆಯನ್ನು ಆಕೃತಿ ಬುಕ್ಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಗುರುಪ್ರಸಾದ್ ಸರ್ ಏರ್ಪಾಡು ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಇದು ಇತ್ತೀಚೆಗಷ್ಟೇ ಬಿಡುಗಡೆಯಾಗಿ ಬಹಳ ಚರ್ಚೆಗೆ ಒಳಗಾಗ್ತಾ ಇರುವಂಥ ಒಂದು ಪುಸ್ತಕ, ಬಹಳ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾದಂಥ ಪುಸ್ತಕ. ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರ ಬದುಕು ಮತ್ತು ಚಿಂತನೆ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಬಂದಿರುವಂಥ ಪುಸ್ತಕಗಳಲ್ಲಿ. ಸೊ ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಈ ಪುಸ್ತಕದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಒಂದು ಚರ್ಚೆ ಏರ್ಪಾಡು ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತೇಳಿ ನಾವು ಒಂದಷ್ಟು ಜನ ಗೆಳೆಯರು ಅಂದ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ವಿ. ಅಂದರೆ ಲೇಖಕರು ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿಗೆ ಬರ್ತಾರೆ ಅಂತ ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲದೇನೆ ಮುಂಚೆನೆ. ಸೊ ಫಾರ್ಚುನೇಟ್ಲಿ ಅವರೇನೆ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿಗೆ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂತ ಗೊತ್ತಾಯಿತು. ಸೊ ನಾವು ಅವರನ್ನ ಕೇಳಿದಾಗ ಅವ್ರು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದು ಮಾತಾಡೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಒಪ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಈ ಪುಸ್ತಕ ಯಾಕೆ ಮುಖ್ಯ ಮತ್ತು ಬಾಬಾ ಸಾಹೇಬ್ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇರುವಂಥ ಪುಸ್ತಕಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಯಾಕೆ ಚರ್ಚೆ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂದರೆ, ಇತ್ತೀಚೆಗೆ ಅಂದರೆ ಕಳೆದ ಒಂದು 10-20 ವರ್ಷಗಳಿಂದ ಈಚೆಗೆ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರ ಚಿಂತನೆಗೆ ನಮ್ಮ ದೇಶದ ಮಟ್ಟದಲ್ಲಿ ಮತ್ತು ಜಾಗತಿಕ ಮಟ್ಟದಲ್ಲಿ ಸಿಗ್ತಾ ಇರುವಂಥ ಒಂದು ಮನ್ನಣೆ ಏನಿದೆ, ಸೊ ಅದನ್ನು ನಾವು ಭಾಳ ಗಂಭೀರವಾಗಿ ತಗೋಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಅನ್ಸುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಉದಾಹರಣೆಗೆ ಹೇಳಬೇಕು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಎಷ್ಟು ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರ ಚಿಂತನೆಗೆ ಪ್ರಾಮುಖ್ಯತೆ ಸಿಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ಈ ಪುಸ್ತಕವೂ ಸೇರಿದಂತೆ ಕಳೆದ 7-8 ತಿಂಗಳಲ್ಲಿ 7ರಿಂದ 8 ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರ ಬದುಕು ಮತ್ತು ಚಿಂತನೆ ಕುರಿತಂತೆ ಪುಸ್ತಕಗಳು ಬಂದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಸವಿತಾ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರು ಮರಾಠಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಬರೆದಿದ್ದಂಥ ಆತ್ಮಕಥೆ ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ಅನುವಾದ ಆಗಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಅಥವಾ ಅಶೋಕ್ ಗೋಪಾಲ್ ಅವರು ಬರೆದಿರುವಂಥ ಪಾರ್ಟ್ ಅಪಾರ್ಟ್ ಆಗಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಅಥವಾ ಶಶಿ ತರೂರ್ ಅಂತವರು ಬರೆದಿರೋ ಶಶಿ ತರೂರ್ ಕೂಡ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಮೇಲೆ ಪುಸ್ತಕ ಬರೆದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಅದನ್ನು ನಾವು ಸೀರಿಯಸ್ ಆಗಿ ಕನ್ಸಿಡರ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ಮತ್ತೆ ಕ್ರಿಸ್ಟೋಫರ್ ಜೆಫರ್ಲಾಟ್ ಮತ್ತೆ ಇನ್ನಿಬ್ರು ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಇನ್ ಲಂಡನ್ ಅಂತ ಅವರು ಲಂಡನ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದಂಥ ದಿನಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಒಂದು ಬಹಳ ಗಂಭೀರವಾದ ಪುಸ್ತಕವನ್ನು ತಂದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಮತ್ತು ಸಯೀದ್ ಅವರು ಅಂಡರ್ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡಿಂಗ್ ಬಿ ಆರ್ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ಸ್ ಅನಿಲೇಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಕಾಸ್ಟ್ ಅನ್ನೋ ಒಂದು ಪುಸ್ತಕವನ್ನು ತಂದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಮತ್ತು ಸ್ಕಾಟ್ ಸ್ಕೌಡ್ ಪ್ರಾಗ್ಮ್ಯಾಟಿಸಮ್ ಥಿಯರಿ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಿರುವಂಥ ಸ್ಕಾಟ್ ಸ್ಕೌಡ್ ಮುಂಚೆ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಮತ್ತು ಜಾನ್ ಡ್ಯೂಯಿ ಅವರ ಸಂಬಂಧದ ಕುರಿತಾಗಿ ರಿಸರ್ಚ್ ಆರ್ಟಿಕಲ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನ ಬರೆದಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅವರು. ಈಗ ಅವರು ಒಂದು ಪೂರ್ಣ ಪ್ರಮಾಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಎವಲ್ಯೂಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಪ್ರಾಗ್ಮ್ಯಾಟಿಸಮ್ ಇನ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಅನ್ನೋ ಒಂದು ಪುಸ್ತಕವನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ಬರೆದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಈ ಇಷ್ಟು ಪುಸ್ತಕಗಳು 7ರಿಂದ 8 ತಿಂಗಳು, ಒಂದು ವರ್ಷದ ಒಳಗಡೆನೆ ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಆಗಿದ್ದಾವೆ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರ ಚಿಂತನೆಗೆ ಸಿಗ್ತಾ ಇರುವಂತ ಮತ್ತು ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಆಯಾಮಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ನಡೆಸ್ತಾ ಇರುವಂತ ಒಂದು ಸಂಶೋಧನೆಗಳಾಗಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಚರ್ಚೆಗಳಾಗಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಅದೇನು ಅನ್ನೋದನ್ನು ನಮಗೆ ತೋರಿಸುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಇವತ್ತು ಬಿಕಮಿಂಗ್ ಬಾಬಾ ಸಾಹೇಬ್ ಪಾರ್ಟ್ 1. ಸೊ ಇದು ಅವರು 2 ಭಾಗಗಳಾಗಿ ಈ ಪುಸ್ತಕವನ್ನು ಬರೆದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಮೊದಲನೇ ವಾಲ್ಯೂಮ್ ಏಪ್ರಿಲ್ 14, 2023 ರಿಲೀಸ್ ಆಯಿತು. ಸೊ ಆಕಾಶ್ ಸಿಂಗ್ ರಾಥೋರ್ ಅವ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಹೇಳಬೇಕು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ಬೇಸಿಕಲಿ ಈಸ್ ಅ ಫಿಲಾಸಫರ್, ಪೊಲಿಟಿಕಲ್ ಥಿಯರಿಸ್ಟ್ ಮತ್ತು ಪ್ರಪಂಚದ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ವಿಶ್ವವಿದ್ಯಾಲಯಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಿರುವಂಥದ್ದು ಮತ್ತು ಅನೇಕ ಪುಸ್ತಕಗಳನ್ನು ಬರೆದಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಮತ್ತು ಸಂಶೋಧನಾ ಪುಸ್ತಕಗಳನ್ನು ಎಡಿಟ್ ಕೂಡ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಕುರಿತಾಗಿನೇ 2-3 ಪುಸ್ತಕಗಳು, ಅದರಲ್ಲೂ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ಸ್ ಪ್ರಿಯಾಂಬಲ್, ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಸಂವಿಧಾನದ ಪ್ರಸ್ತಾವನೆ ಕುರಿತಾಗಿ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ಸ್ ಪ್ರಿಯಾಂಬಲ್ ಪುಸ್ತಕ ಒಂದು 2-3 ವರ್ಷಗಳ ಹಿಂದೆ ರಿಲೀಸ್ ಆಗಿತ್ತು. ಮತ್ತು ನಮಗೆಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಗೊತ್ತಿದೆ, ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವರಿಗೆ 125 ವರ್ಷ ಆದಾಗ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ಇಂಟರ್ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್ ಕಾನ್ಫರೆನ್ಸ್ ಆಗಿತ್ತು, ಕ್ವೆಸ್ಟ್ ಫಾರ್ ಈಕ್ವಿಟಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ. ಸೊ ಆ ಒಂದು ಕಾನ್ಫರೆನ್ಸ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಮಂಡನಾಗಿದ್ದಂಥ ವಿಶ್ವಮಟ್ಟದ ಚಿಂತಕರ ಎಲ್ಲ ಪ್ರಬಂಧಗಳನ್ನು ಸೇರಿಸಿ ಅವರು 5 ವಾಲ್ಯೂಮ್ಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಆ ಪುಸ್ತಕಗಳನ್ನ ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅದರ ಎಡಿಟರ್ ಆಗಿ ಕೂಡ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಮತ್ತು ಪೊಲಿಟಿಕಲ್ ಫಿಲಾಸಫಿ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟಂಥ ಪುಸ್ತಕಗಳನ್ನು ಅವರು ತಂದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಇದು ಅವರ ಅಂಬೇಡ್ಕರ್ ಅವ್ರ ಕುರಿತಾದಂಥ 2ನೇ ಪುಸ್ತಕ. ಮತ್ತು ಅವರು ತಮ್ಮ ಇಂಟ್ರಡಕ್ಷನ್ ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಬಹಳ ಸ್ಪಷ್ಟವಾಗಿ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಯಾಕೆ ನಾನು ಈ ಪುಸ್ತಕವನ್ನು ಬರೆದಿದ್ದೀನಿ, ಅದರ ಅವಶ್ಯಕತೆ ಏನಿತ್ತು ಅನ್ನೋದನ್ನು. ಸೊ ಅದನ್ನ ಅವ್ರ ಮಾತಲ್ಲೇ ನಾವು ಕೇಳೋಣ. ಮತ್ತು ಈ ಪುಸ್ತಕದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಚರ್ಚೆ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ನಾವು ಯಾರನ್ನ ಕೇಳ್ಬೋದು ಅಂತ ಅಂದ್ಕೊಂಡಾಗ ಹೊಸ ತಲೆಮಾರಿನ ಸ್ಕಾಲರ್ಸನ್ನ ಕರೆಸಿ ಮಾತಾಡ್ಸಿದ್ರೆ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿರುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ ನಮಗೆ ಅನ್ನಿಸ್ತು. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಇವತ್ತು ನಮ್ಮ ಜೊತೆ ಕೆ ಆರ್ ದಿಶಾ ಅವರಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರು ಮುಂಬೈನ ಟಿಸ್ನಿಂದ ಪೋಸ್ಟ್ ಗ್ರಾಜ್ಯುಯೇಷನ್ ಅನ್ನು ಮುಗಿಸಿ ಈಗ ಬಾಂಬೆ IIT-ನಲ್ಲಿ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಆಗಿರುವಂಥ ಅಂತರ್ಜಾತಿ ವಿವಾಹಗಳ ಕುರಿತು, ಅಂದರೆ ಅಂತರ್ ಕ್ಯಾಸ್ಟ್ ಮ್ಯಾರೇಜಸ್ ಕುರಿತು ಸಂಶೋಧನೆಯನ್ನು ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರು ನಮ್ಮ ಜೊತೆ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಮತ್ತು ವಿಜಯಶಾಂತಿ ಅವರು ಸೆಂಟ್ ಜೋಸೆಫ್ ಕಾಮರ್ಸ್ ಕಾಲೇಜ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಆಗಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಮತ್ತು ತಮ್ಮ ಬಹಳ ಸೂಕ್ಷ್ಮವಾದಂಥ ಒಂದು ಬರಹಗಳಿಂದ, ಇಂಗ್ಲಿಷ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಬರಿತಾ ಇರೋ ಬರಹಗಳಿಂದ ಅವರು ಗಮನ ಸೆಳೆದಿರುವಂಥ ಒಬ್ಬ ಹೊಸ ತಲೆಮಾರಿನ ಚಿಂತಕಿ. ಸೊ ಇವರಿಬ್ಬರು ನಮ್ಮ ಜೊತೆನಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರು ಆಕಾಶ್ ಸಿಂಗ್ ರಾಥೋರ್ ಅವ್ರನ್ನ ಮಾತಾಡಿಸ್ತಾರೆ. ಸೊ ನಾನು ಕೂಡ ಅವ್ರ ಜೊತೆನಲ್ಲಿ ಇರ್ತೀನಿ. ಸೊ ಇವತ್ತು ನಮ್ಮ ಜೊತೆ ಆಕಾಶ್ ಸಿಂಗ್ ರಾಥೋರ್ ಅವರು ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ನಾವು ಅವ್ರನ್ನ ಎಲ್ಲರ ಪರವಾಗಿ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿಗೆ ಬಂದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರು ನಮ್ಮೆಲ್ಲರ ಪರವಾಗಿ ಅವರನ್ನ ಸ್ವಾಗತ ಮಾಡೋಣ. ವಿ ವೆಲ್ಕಮ್ ಯು ಸರ್. ವಿ ಆರ್ ವೆರಿ ಹ್ಯಾಪಿ ಟು ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಯು ಹಿಯರ್. ಸೊ ಐ ವುಡ್ ಲೈಕ್ ಟು ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ವಿತ್ most basic question, I think. So you have worked on intellectual thought of Dr. B R Ambedkar. So you have edited 5 volumes on Ambedkar's thought, and few years back you have published Ambedkar's preamble, and now you have written biography Ambedkar. So what motivated you to write this book? What motivated you to write Ambedkar's biography?
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So thank you for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here. Especially happy to see all of you, but also to be surrounded by books. That's where I feel really at home. My very sincere apologies for speaking in English and not Kannada. It's very regretful for me that I don't have that competency. So I hope it's okay that I speak in English. In 2009, 2010, one book you didn't mention is my edition of the Buddha and his Dhamma. That was
sorry.
No, it doesn't matter. But that's where the idea of the biography first emerged, because as you had mentioned, Savita Ambedkar's autobiography has just been translated from Marathi into English recently, and all of the publications of the Buddha and his Dhamma from 1957 until 2010 excluded a preface, that an autobiographical preface that Babasaheb had written, preface to the Buddha and his Dhamma. And in that autobiographical preface, he says some things about Savita Ambedkar that could not be really tolerated or digested by his inner circle, who was very suspicious of her and believed, I think quite unjustly, that she had poisoned him. So, not wanting to publish the very opposite sentiment that Babasaheb had written in his autobiographical preface, that on the contrary, she had kept him alive much longer than he would have lived had he not met her. This preface was suppressed and never published. So when I came across this, I realized there's a great deal about the life of Babasaheb that remains, even in the 21st century, opaque to us, that remains unclear, unknown to us. If this is just one small thing, there must be other things. Then, as we see Ambedkar's autobiographical writings, Waiting for a Visa, which is also unfinished, and has some very deep mysteries about it also. The very title, Waiting for a Visa, why is that the title of his autobiography? The word visa is not mentioned a single time in the entire text that we have. So we don't even know why Ambedkar titled his autobiography the way that he titled it. That's very mysterious. So there are so many things about the life of this very public figure that somehow are completely private and unknown to us. So in 2010, I determined to try to find simple answers to these kinds of questions. And it led me, of course, to read all of the literature that we're all familiar with collectively. At that time in 2010, my reading knowledge of Marathi was still very poor. I had only been married to a Maharashtrian for 6 years, and all of her pushing 6 years was not successful, but Maharashtrians never stop, so so eventually I fell victim to this. But while I was reading the English and Hindi writings biographical writings on Ambedkar, as we all notice, many inconsistencies. One will say something, Dhananjay Keer's, which is, has been considered the most authoritative and comprehensive for the non-Marathi speaker. Of course, Khairmode has been the most authoritative for the Marathi speaker. In Keer, we get this very distasteful presence of Savarkar. His name, Savarkar's name, is mentioned in Keer's biography 50 times. 50. Now, even if Savarkar were important to Ambedkar and his life, still 50 times means that it's, every sixth page you have to read the name Savarkar in the biography of Babasaheb Ambedkar. I found that very, very difficult to digest. And I wondered, why is this the case? So if Keer is, as he had also written a book on the biography of Savarkar, which is continued to be referred to today for its comprehensiveness. If Keer is trying to unify somehow his two heroes, Ambedkar and Savarkar, through the biography of Ambedkar, that means that he's not doing justice to letting Ambedkar be who he is, because obviously Savarkar was not important in Ambedkar's life, and on the contrary, he was someone whom Ambedkar found morally and politically bankrupt. And he, in fact, said so in a letter to Savarkar. However, Keer only publishes the first page of this two-page letter. And on the first page of this letter, Ambedkar writes, as any civilized man would write, my dear Savarkar, hope you are well. These kinds of niceties that you would write even to an enemy if you're being civilized. But eventually, when you see the second page, he really begins to explain what he thinks about Savarkar. And he calls him childish, and he calls him, very many a straightforward appraisal of the dangers of Savarkar's thought, and his request to Savarkar to please mature and change and stop speaking, using the kinds of words that he uses in a public forum. So Keer does not publish page 2, he publishes only page 1. And that leads to 70 years of what we can still hear today in Swarajya or by RSS outfits, that there's not only a friendship or camaraderie between Savarkar and Ambedkar, but they use the niceties of Babasaheb's introduction, first page, to suggest that there's even an ideological connection. So based on the politeness and friendship, cordial relation, they say there's also some ideological connection. Now this is very dangerous. The most recent biographies of Savarkar have continued to rely on Keer to make this claim that Ambedkar and Savarkar were very close. Not only personal terms, but even ideologically. And yet, when one finds page 2 of this letter, which is in the possession of Vijay Survada in Maharashtra, one sees the truth. Now, why did Keer suppress page 2 of the letter? Why? Possibly to allow this misinformation to continue to grow the way that it has grown. So in the course of reading the English literature, the Hindi literature, I found not only misinformation, I found disinformation. Because this is propaganda, this is disinformation, this is not misinformation. It's fine if a researcher makes a mistake and so on. Eventually, when I had developed the competency to read the Marathi literature, I found two phenomena. Disinformation does not seem to be there in the Marathi literature, really authentic attempts to understand Babasaheb. But a lot of misinformation is there, precisely because the community who's doing this scholarship doesn't have access to certain archives, to certain documents. Khairmode attempted to do the best he can, in good faith, to confirm facts about Babasaheb's life from Columbia University, from LSE from the British Library and Museum. But the poor man is writing from Maharashtra, he's writing letters from Bombay and sending them. And sometimes he's not replied to. And often when he is replied to, he's given misinformation. And this begins to circulate. So one sees two sides in the Marathi literature. One sees the misinformation done through no fault of their own, but also what we call the hagiography. So the kind of deification of Babasaheb. Now I have to say, I have married into a family that themselves deify Babasaheb. At my marriage, Babasaheb was there with the Buddha, and that was the process of my own conversion, and we bowed down and we prayed and so on. I have no issues with the deification of Babasaheb. From a personal point of view, I understand it, and I even feel a great attraction to doing so. But there are 1 billion plus people in this country who are not going to be introduced to the ideas, the progressive ideas of Dr. Ambedkar, if deification is the path to bring them in. They will respond perhaps to ideas. They're not going to respond to mere reverence. And so I hope I've introduced now a few of the elements that made me want to write this book and the way that I wrote the book. There's disinformation and there's misinformation that has perpetuated to the current day and gets repeated by RSS outfits, by academics, especially reactionary, conservative, orthodox academics. And then there's misinformation that needs to be corrected. And then there's deification. Now, the deification, while I said I sympathize with, one very important thing about Babasaheb's life and the current day, the climate we find ourselves in. I teach at many universities, Mumbai University, Delhi University, JNU, and so on. And all of my students, especially the progressive, the left, the liberal, but also from the marginalized communities, Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi, and so on, they come to me now in a way that I didn't see 10 years ago, with complete desperation in their eyes, because there seems to be no hope for their future. The jobs are disappearing quickly, and those jobs that remain available are being given to, handed out for political reasons and to cronies and so on. And they seem extremely desperate and pessimistic. Now, that's dangerous when your youth, the generation that we hope, the older ones, that we hope are going to bring some change, when they are so desperate that they are looking to you for some kind of guidance. There's only one thing that I can tell them, which is you imagine yourself with no freedom, no opportunity, and your material conditions that are completely pessimistic. But you look back at Babasaheb's life in 1900. Do you think he had more freedom than you have in 2020? Do you think he had materially more than you have in 2021, 2022? Do you think he had a future that he could foresee with any hope more than you have in 2023? Obviously, however bad the situation has become for us and them today, it was worse for him at that time. And yet, through his efforts, through some luck also, but through his continuous endeavor, discipline, consistency, he managed to triumph out of that situation and to create, basically every one of us is in this room because of his achievements. But his achievements were not the achievements of a god. That's why we can't always deify him. I can deify him at home, but in the public sense, when I tell these youngsters that you have to have a hope and you have to remain optimistic, because had he not had any hope, had he had the pessimism that you have in your eyes, we would not have the Babasaheb that has given us such a platform for our ability to advance today. So it's important, if we hold him as an exemplar, as a model, that he be a man. Because gods can do many things, but to prove that a man can do it, that's important for passing on to the next generation, that they have hope. If he could do it as a human of flesh and blood, then you can do it too. Hence, my fixation on representing Babasaheb as a person, not as a deified person. Hence, my fixation on correcting the facts. Everywhere that I've seen misinformation in all of the biographies that have come before, I've corrected those facts. And then, hence, my special concern to correct the disinformation. So, presenting Babasaheb as a human being so he can be a model for the youth of today, that they can have a future if they practice the same kinds of discipline and hope and perseverance and tenacity that he practiced. And correct the facts and correct the lies. This has been the project of the book, and I hope I have done at least some of that. It's up for all of you to decide whether I've achieved it, but that's where the aim came from. That's the background of it, and that's why I've taken it up.
Thank you, sir, for giving the detailed information as to what drove you to write the piece. More than a question, I would like to start off with things where we as readers have connected to it. More often than not, personal writings is where we connect to. Right? That's one of the reasons that we feel that autobiography of a full-fledged autobiography of R Ambedkar would have been better. However, there were moments in this book, though it's biography, why I mentioned though it's biography, of course it's not his voice, I did feel connected to certain sections. I would like to read those sections and probably start off the conversation around how it felt connected. So one of the questions as a Dalit woman that I face is, how do we understand parenting at home, right? There is conflict with your parent for certain beliefs that they would hold and certain beliefs that we would hold due to the generational difference, or sometimes the kind of access that they would have provided us. Such moments have happened between my father and me as well. So there are these conflicts. I find that I like Ilayaraja music. I like his music, but his political stance brings a lot of conflict. So do I like his music? Do I leave him because of his political ideas? I love my father, but he could also have been at many moments gender insensitive. He could have been different, right? So one such section in this book is in chapter 2, the alma mater. So the title is alma mater. You are referring to what Ambedkar and his father have that conversation. Can I read that with your permission?
Yes, of course.
Ambedkar's father had a huge impact on his young self, and some of this, as well as a glimpse into the nature of their relationship, can be discerned from a charming story that Ambedkar recounted towards the very end of his own life. The recounting is this: my father was a military officer, but at the same time a very religious person. He brought me up under strict discipline. From an early age, I found certain contradictions in my father's religious way of life. He compelled me and my elder brother to read every evening a portion of the Mahabharata and Ramayana to my sisters and to others who assembled at our house. This went on for years. One day I asked my father why he insisted upon our reading the Mahabharata and Ramayana, which recounted the greatness of the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, and repeated the stories of the degradation of the Shudras and untouchables. My father did not like the question, merely replying, "You must not ask such silly questions. You are only boys. You must do as you are told." He was a Roman patriarch, exercising patricia potestas over his children. I alone could take a little liberty with him. This line hit hard for me. I alone could take a little liberty with him. I think I have felt that with my father as well. I alone could take a lot of liberty with him. And that was because my mother had died in my childhood, leaving me to the care of my aunt. After several days, I asked the same question. My father had evidently prepared a reply in the meantime. So the reply is this:
The reason I ask you to read the Mahabharata and Ramayana is this. We belong to the untouchables, and you are likely to develop an inferiority complex, which is natural. The value of the Mahabharata and Ramayana lies in removing their inferiority complex. Witness Drona and Karna, they were low-born, but to what heights they rose. Look at Valmiki, he was a Kohli, but authored the Ramayana. It is for removing this inferiority complex that I asked you to read the Mahabharata and Ramayana. There was some force in my father's argument, but I was not satisfied. I responded, I don't like Bhishma and Drona, or Krishna, Bhishma, or Krishna. Bhishma and Drona were hypocrites. They said one thing and did quite the opposite. Krishna believed in fraud. His life is nothing but a series of frauds. I also dislike Rama. Just examine how he behaved in the Surpanaka episode and in the Vali Sugriva episode, and his monstrous behavior towards Sita. This is one section. And later in the book, there are different moments when he's getting his father back, right? I think for us as Dalits, it's going to be a continuous, conflict for us, because this is the kind of conversation that we are going to have more often than not. I hope this is fine, not that it's wrong, but how do we grapple with these conversations? And it demands a lot more energy to talk to our parents, right? I think this part was the section that actually took me further. In fact, preface, you kept on saying blood and flesh, blood, right? I was like, what is it that he's trying to say? I want to know what does he mean by bringing him in this phase. I think this section caught my attention as a reader. When you read, how did you feel about this section? Before writing.
Yeah. Yes, I had almost the precisely same conversation with my father as young Ambedkar had with his father. My father was also very religious and demanded that we read, Gita and all of this, and all I found were contradictions and difficulties. It seemed to me to be a book quite obviously justifying caste in metaphysics, making a negative social phenomenon into a cosmic natural phenomenon. And I alone could take some liberties with my father, I think because I was the youngest of 3 children. And we had very similar conversation to this one. It was precisely this kind of identification that led me more and more into studying Ambedkar as an academic and as a scholar. So it's that sense of intimate relationship with him that has drawn me in. Not he is one of the most powerful intellects of the 20th century. And I'm a intellectual and a scholar, so obviously there's that attraction. But there are many powerful intellects in the 20th century. It was a century of remarkable minds. However, the spirit of young Ambedkar, the uniqueness of his personality is what really drew me in. So I can't speak to your experiences and what it's like to be a Dalit girl speaking to her parents, but there's a curious analogy about the universality of this, what Ambedkar represents here, that many of us have had this experience, and the fact that Ambedkar articulates it so as being so decisive in his life really draws a person in. A person such as me, this was very captivating for me and keeps me studying his remarkable intellectual work, because I feel such a personal connection.
First of all, I would like to congratulate you on this book. You have actually succeeded in doing what you set out to do. And I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book because one, it's very simple and easy reading, but it really needs careful reading. you need to pay a lot of attention to what you're reading, because you know so much about Ambedkar, you have heard about him, you have read about him, but this book comprehensively bring everything together. So in that way, I really think this book is something one could introduce new minds to Ambedkar. This book would be really helpful for that. And as much as it is about Ambedkar becoming Babasaheb, I actually saw Ambedkar not as an individual in this book, but as a collective, because here in the process of Ambedkar becoming a Babasaheb, it's also making of Babasaheb, because his father plays a major role in his life in making him a Babasaheb, because he provides him education, and also the families they come from, the discipline he installs in his children, and also the migration he takes on, moving from his Satara to Bombay, because that itself is the move of the century, because that's what makes Babasaheb, right? And also you can't see Ambedkar without seeing Sayaji Gaikwad or Shahu Maharaj or Kirloskar, and also Bole's resolution, that plays out very importantly in pre-Mahad and post-Mahad Ambedkar. And his friends, it could be his Parsi friends, Ramabai, and even R.B. More for that matter, because he invites him for Mahad, and that what changes Ambedkar's, from his ideas to direct action, taking on direct action. So I really like that thing where you kind of divided, look at Ambedkar as pre-Mahad Ambedkar and a post-Mahad Ambedkar. So, there is complete change in his thinking. And also, I want to know about, like Khairmode and Keer has written some 70 years back, but you being in 2023 and looking back, and also there is so much of discourse around caste which has evolved, and also there is so much of work done on Ambedkar itself. So how do you as a biographer look at it from now and write that biography? Because obviously in your book we can see that, from the beginning to end, you track his ideas on religion. It could be from his father in the very, beginning, where his father, the very extract she read out, where he talks about religion. And then also you mention, you bring that out in the book where he says that, Parsis, not just Hindus have untouchability, but also Parsis follow untouchability, and also about his experience with his Christian friend who does not accommodate him when he's thrown out of the in Baroda. So and also his, very importantly, I think his 3 editorials which he writes, the religious battle of Mahad. So I want to know that if a biographer would have been written some few years back, would the approach be the same? I know there was no access for Khairmode, and hence he was unable to get some facts, right? So since now at this point of time, due to technologies and certain global access we have, so you are able to kind of get those facts. But also, do you think that this discourse which has emerged in these last 70 years has influenced very deeply the way you have put your biography?
Thank you. Thank you for the kind words also. So we should, we have to acknowledge the work that has come before, even not the disinformative work, but even the misinformed work, because it wasn't the fault of the researchers and the authors. After Keer and Khairmode, so the 70-year-old biographies, there was a new wave of several biographies that came out. Wonderful works from Elinor Elliott and Gail Lomben and Christophe Jaffalo. And this was around 2004, this area, so about 20 years ago. So we have the first big phase of 70 years ago. That pushed here all of the non-Maharashtrian biographies, whether in Punjabi, in Hindi, in English, they all relied on Keer. Then all of the Maharashtrian, almost all except for one prominent one, of the Marathi biographies relied on Khairmode. And then you find in 20 years back, when the fresh set of English biographies come out from Eliot and Omvent and Jaffelot, Eliot does a lot of original research, great deal of original research, and her work is a wonderful resource. But when it comes to Ambedkar's life, specifically his biography, as it were, she relies again on Khairmode. And Jaffelot, I'm not that, I'm sorry to say, that impressed with Jaffelot, his biography, and I think I make that a little clear in this. And even I feel insulted that in 2023, Ambedkar London, he publishes a chapter in that, which is the same as he had written in 2004. We deserve better, you can't recycle a 20-year-old paper in a new book and suggest that it's your fresh research. So Jaffelot is not that, compelling to me, but Eleanor Eliot, is a real pioneer. But her biographical relies on Khairmode. Jaffelot's biographical information relies on Keer. Gail Omvent's biographical information relies on Eliot. And as you said in your introduction, you have Ashok Gopal's new book. This is essentially an English translation of Khairmode. Khairmode was in many volumes. Ashok Gopal has distilled it into one very big volume. There is no original research about his life. It's very, very good book. I mean, I don't want to insult it because he's a living contemporary, right? So I don't like that he begins with Gandhi Ambedkar. We've had enough of Gandhi Ambedkar. Let's have Ambedkar without Gandhi for a change. And I don't know why Ashok decided in 2023 to start a book with Gandhi Ambedkar again. So that, I didn't like that, but nevertheless it's valuable that he should take Khairmode to the non-Marathi readers. Shashi Tharoor, he relies on Keer and Jaffelot. Ambedkar in London, again, for the biographical, they rely on Keer. So all of the biographies, even the new ones, for the biographical part, keep going back to these two sources. That's why I found it very important, actually, not to worry so much about contemporary scholarship around Ambedkar's thought, because there was very brilliant work on that, and focus instead on the lack of any contemporary scholarship on his personality, on his person, on what he actually, what day was he born? What year was he born? These are actually mysteries. But that's not important when we consider what he achieved, what his ideas were, and so on. I don't want to focus on his ideas because there's such excellent work on that. And of course, I do that in the other books and so on. Here I wanted, finally, let's find out what his beating heart was like. The volume 2 is called The Passion of Babasaheb Ambedkar, because he so many times he describes how a situation moved him to tears, how he was really flesh and blood, how he experienced personal anguish at the condition of his people. This side of him is a side with which we can all personally relate. Whereas the scholar Ambedkar, his intellect and who can relate to BA, MA, MA again, LLB, PhD again, who can relate to that, his intellectual achievements? It's very difficult. There we have to put him on a pedestal. But as a man who describes his flowing tears, his love letter to Ramabai, which is what begins volume 2, this is what we can all identify and relate to. So I didn't find it too difficult to negotiate through the decades of scholarship and Ambedkar studies, because my interest was, what have all of those people ignored? They've ignored that beating heart, and that's what I want to focus on. I hope that makes
Yeah,
sense.
Thank you, sir. As you were sharing, and I think it's very evident what Tenmuli actually gives you as a blurb. She says, I respect, and so she says, the empathy of Aakash Singh Rathore biography is unparalleled. I think while you're sharing also that's coming out, something that I would like to bring our attention to is, of course, we are aware of the love that Ambedkar had for his books, right? And in attendant details, if I'm not wrong, he also mentions that this percentage of our earnings should be dedicated every month to buy books. And we are sitting in a bookstore. I think it makes it even more meaningful. On these lines, again, you brought in different sections of his love, right? Like he goes to London, there he collects books. He goes to the US, he gets books. And he's in Bombay, he goes gets books. But when it felt really hard to take is when he's returning to India and he's not able to get all the books because the ship that he's boarding cannot accommodate. And then he requests his friend to send it. And unfortunately, it drowns. And his thesis drowns, right? And to know that, and of course, Disha would know, considering that she's doing her PhD, it's not an easy task to write a thesis. And this man's thesis just goes there and then he has to sit and rewrite. I think these moments are the ones that I really found, interesting. I think I'll ask the question, which is a little, I'm entering the realm of writing style. What I found again interesting is the titles of the chapters, right? I'll read a few of the titles. An Indian in New York, London Calling. London Calling sounded very nice. Sleepless in Baroda, a loud voice for the voiceless, lunchless in London, right? And it goes on. So could you talk a little bit on how you arrived at these titles for the chapters?
That's funny. Are you a writer? You like to?
I'm a literature student, so I just find it curious.
Okay.
Yeah.
So before I address that, I just want to say one more thing. Actually, I say one thing even before that one thing, if you don't mind.
Yes.
My father was a professor at Columbia University. I grew up on that campus. I studied at LSE. I took my LLB. I became a lawyer. These are strange, curious overlaps with the life of Babasaheb at Columbia, at LSE, doing LLB. And I didn't know about, this was just a curious coincidence that I discovered later. I have, since childhood, been an avid book collector, absolutely. And there are still books that I can remember. I remember the book cover, I remember the feeling in my hand. And these books are lost now. And I'm now 51 years old, and I'll think back to when I was, Dostoevsky has just been translated. I used to have a wonderful edition of the Brothers Karamazov when I was 20 years old. And I sometimes lying in bed, I think about that book. And you find in Ambedkar that he's sitting in the library where a book is right in front of him, and he suddenly writes a letter to a friend in Bombay and says, there's a bookshop down the lane. I want you to go and pick up this book, even though he has access to the book right now. Only a book collector can understand that from inside. Because anyone else would say, why don't you just take the library book? No, it means something different to have it in your hands at all. So I realized that there by coincidence, are so many things that I have in common with him. That's what keeps bringing me back to him, into his life. I also lost my PhD when I was in 2002. My computer broke. I didn't know that hard drives could be taken out and you could find that data. I just rewrote my PhD, and then when I found out that it had happened to Ambedkar, so it's very strange coincidences in my life that when I look back, I see they're very much like him. So somehow I feel that he has inspired me in some, unnatural ways as well as intellectual ways. Now, those were the remarks that I wanted to make related to your first point. Now the second one. How is it that we are going to bring people over to Ambedkarite thought? This is something that preoccupies me. As a political theorist, I was teaching a course at JNU on modern Indian political thought. And I taught, for the first time, I believe, in a central government university, I taught Ambedkar's Riddles in Hinduism. And ABVP started protesting, and they boycotted the class, and they made a picket line in front of the classroom. So I couldn't enter the classroom. They wouldn't allow me to enter. And I thought, actually, why don't all of you come into the class, just hear what this book is about, because I'm sure you've never read it. And then if you find it as, offensive as you believe that it is, then you can throw me out once again. You will start this. So when they came in, the first, some of them, of course, not everybody came, but 1, 2, or 3 of them came in. The first thing that I introduced them to was Ambedkar's critique of the Aryan migration hypothesis. Now, Ambedkar had a very different motivation for his skepticism, but it certainly overlaps with these people ideologically who want to project this out of India hypothesis, these absurd ideas. So by showing that they actually have similarity, or some overlapping beliefs, I was able to bring them in. Now, that's just one example. How do you bring in people who don't want to be brought in, who don't want to hear what you have to say? So the rhetorical, the choosing the titles. So Sleepless in Baroda, there's a very famous film, Sleepless in Seattle.
Yeah.
Right? Englishman in New York is a very famous song by Sting or the Police or something. So an Indian in New York. Lunchless in London, of course, Ambedkar describes his hunger, that he couldn't afford to eat. He had to send money back to Ramabai. She couldn't afford to eat. So his quest for an education, which was a precondition for his life goal, the emancipation of the untouchables, required him not having any meals, required his starvation and so on. So I wanted to draw people in through things that they know, so that they would slowly be introduced to his ideas in a gentle way, so they wouldn't immediately run off or protest. That's why these kinds of titles and this kind of strategy, rhetorical strategy, was chosen, because there are plenty of Ambedkarites, but they are not enough. So how do we make non-Ambedkarites into Ambedkarites? You have to coax them in, you have to lure them in, and you have to show them that it is something with which they have overlapping ideas, whether they know it or not. And so that's why I wrote the book in this style and with the rhetoric. And of course, for first-generation readers, I think if you've seen the evolution of the way that I've written my books, they are getting more and more simple and straightforward, less with jargon and things like that. And that's because I realized that first-generation readers, who are really the ones that need information, need education, they have always been pushed out by academics and intellectuals and theorists who present it with a kind of such difficult language that first-generation learners are locked out. So I'm trying also to write in a simple, accessible way, while communicating everything that needs to be communicated. And I hope even the second, I feel like I'm getting better at this. Ambedkar's preamble I tried. I think this one is even better in the sense of access to by first-generation learners.
Just want to add something with that. In our country, just the title makes them off, right? Riddles in Hinduism, if we read, it's surprising that he's actually not putting the religion down and he's posing these questions. In fact, there are moments where he's also saying that core of it is also a little different from what we are thinking. Just the fact that you get the title, at least read and then critique, rather than just critiquing it because of the title, right? I think I like the titles. It's just the play with words is something that I like. I'll hand it over to Michelle.
So you set out to, look at this information But in that process, when did you come across the misinformation related to dates? How did you realize that these dates are accurate? Like even the birth year of Ambedkar, or his submission of PhD, or returning back from London. So there are a lot of confusions about his age in that way, right?
Yes.
So then, how did you realize? When did you realize that there is this factual inaccuracy about his birth year?
I think that it's such a jarring thing to make that realization that you don't want to realize it for a long time. So it might come to you. For example, Ambedkar's letter to at that time Shada Kabir, his future Savita Ambedkar, they're choosing their wedding date, and Savita Ambedkar wants the 14th of April. Because it's his birthday, and he writes, "That's not my birthday. I prefer the 15th of April." So one reads it and says, "Okay, maybe he's just trying to do something." Then in London, I came across this his passport. So this passport, in Dr. Ambedkar's own handwriting, shows his birth year as 1892. Now that I can't dismiss. It's in his own handwriting. I have another document in his own handwriting, which was his scholarship application to Baroda State. That is where he writes 1893. And then, of course, 1891 is very prevalent. So we have 3 different years, all in Ambedkar's own handwriting. So one then has to start wondering, what is going on with these dates? What does it mean? Why does he make these decisions? What is he trying to do? Later, when studying Waiting for a Visa, and I see that Dr. Ambedkar himself writes so Ambedkar was not a man who liked to speak about himself. He was not an egomaniac. I don't want to create a polarity between Gandhi and Ambedkar that's existed for so long, but Gandhi was very happy to write his autobiography, and it just goes on talking about himself. But Ambedkar, I think, part of his Buddhist anatta idea, you don't want to reify the soul when the soul is impermanent. Why should you make it permanent through an autobiography? So Ambedkar only spoke about his personal life when speaking to his own community. His public speeches to the general category people, he never spoke about his personal life. Now, why would he speak with his community? Obviously, because he wanted to identify with them. Who is this man, so learned, such a towering figure? He cannot be a Mahat. He can't be a Mahat. No Mahat is like him. And so every time he gives a speech to his community, he says, I was born here. I studied in this school. I ate just like you. I was not permitted to. So he shows the identity of his community and himself in order to show them that you can be like me also, because I'm not different. I'm no different from you. So he always spoke about himself, autobiographical remarks, but only with his community. So in Waiting for a Visa, he decides for the first time that certain events of his life are important enough to give even to general category, to foreigners, to the British, to everybody, like his experiences in Baroda. And yet, he writes the wrong dates for when he was in Baroda. His own autobiography, where he finally decides it's important enough to communicate to the world, he gets the dates wrong. Now, if Ambedkar himself is getting his dates wrong, one realizes, of course, another thing with which I have another, because, this man is trying to change the world. He doesn't care whether it was January or February. What difference does it make? And when someone is goading him, like Khairmode is saying, but exactly when were you in Germany? He says 1921. Well, no, he was actually in Germany in 1922. But Khairmode is not, if you're interviewing, I'm sure some of you are journalists, if you're interviewing your subject, basically you have the authentic information there. You're not going to go back and check whether this person is right about the day he was born or right about the year he received his degree. You're going to take that. So Ambedkar's disinterest in his own, ego, all of these things, has actually been part of what has led to so much misinformation. So one doesn't only need to go back to the biographies and check the facts. One needs to go back to what Babasaheb himself said and confirm them against archives and records. And this nobody thought to do. No one thought to do it because it seems like something that wouldn't need to be done. But when I saw this passport in London, I realized, no, Ambedkar does not care about the year he was born, the day he was born, when he was in Europe, when he was in Germany, when he was in London, which degree he got, when he was in Baroda, when he took this train, when he went to Mahat. All of that, he consistently just, the fact that it happened is important for him. I got a degree at Columbia. I got a degree in London. I did the Mahad Satyagraha. These are significant things. But when he did it, this unfortunately falls upon the contemporary biographer to go back and find that information. So, one doesn't think it needs to be done. And from 2010 to 2020, I didn't think it needed to be done. In the biography, I point to mistakes I made in Ambedkar's preamble, which I published in 2020. I made mistakes relying on Ambedkar's own words and on the scholarship, which now I have to correct. So it's an ongoing process, of course, even when you're committed. And Khairmode was very committed. Keer not so much, but Khairmode was committed, and yet mistake after mistake comes in.
So this is with regard to, correct me if I'm wrong, and if I am making any criticism, I hope it doesn't come too strong. The thing is, there are many sections where there is a little bit of repetition. For example, I don't know if it's done deliberately, meaning 2 years he lived here, again he came back, factual details you are repeating in different sections. Is it deliberately done to ensure, because there is a bit of, it's a sociological writing in terms of style. It's not the fictional approach that one is taking. So, is that a deliberate attempt in repeating certain parts? I'm not talking about complete details, but there are sections you have done it. I would like to know about that.
Yeah. That could be bad writing, or it could also be, I'm very specific when in another biography a mistake has been made. So if, for example, I mentioned about Germany, every single book in the world, except for this one, puts him there on the wrong date. And so I might say it more than once to try to ensure that people are getting this, because sometimes it's important, sometimes it's not important. I know that as facts come out, what was Ambedkar doing in Germany? He was getting a third PhD in economics. But what he was really trying to do was to recover the possibility of studying Sanskrit with the greatest Sanskritist on the planet of that time. But the university would not let him in because he has no bachelor's, master's in Sanskrit or Indian studies. And so he has to kind of get in as an economics student for third PhD and then slowly sit in all the Sanskrit classes. Now what I know is that as soon as the right-wing people get hold of the fact that he studied at the university, that he applied for economics, they're going to say, Ambedkar didn't know any Sanskrit, so why did he write Hindu Code Bill? Why did he write riddles in Hinduism? Why did, all of these kinds of things. So there are some facts that I need to repeat and repeat so that they can't be exploited by people who want to exploit information badly, or they're correcting long-standing misinformation. That's what I tried to do with repetition, but it's also possible that, writing is difficult, as you know. So sometimes it can just be poor writing.
Thanks.
Last.
Sorry, I forgot my question. So there are very interesting facts in this. You write about how Ambedkar was influenced with suffragist movement and how he had a Chinese first Chinese women who passed out of Columbia to his classmate and also professors who participated in suffragist movement. I want to know how did race actually influence or Ambedkar, and because racial experience of Gandhi initiated his political journey. Right. In that case, how did race matter to Ambedkar, or did it matter at all? It could be different when he's in London, right? It's a different, because there are Indians and it's an imperial state. But while he was in New York, how did race actually affect or had any kind of influence on him?
So this is slightly controversial subject actually, because when you sent me the location of the bookshop, a photo of Suraj giving a talk here comes up. Now, one of the great achievements of Suraj is to unite Black and Dalit activists in US, and this is a very kind of promising solidarity. However, as I try to show, it's based on, I'm sorry, so a lot of the movement, the activism that's happening today gets put into a historical grounding. They say that the work we are doing to unite Dalits and Blacks is coming out of Ambedkar's own experience. But the historical fact is that did not happen. So, Columbia University, do you really think white racist Americans are going to put Columbia University in Harlem? These are the highest of aristocrats. Just a small side story that might interest you. We all represent Babasaheb in these very elegant Western suits, right, which he wore. But did you ever ask yourself, when did he start wearing these suits? So, because it's certainly not common. So this happened when he received the Baroda scholarship. He received also an outfit allowance. And anyone in government knows this outfit allowance, yeah? And the Maharaja told him that, be careful at Columbia, they're all very elite, aristocrat snobs. So you must dress yourself very well for that. So in 1913, Ambedkar buys a very nice, elegant three-piece suit for his attending Columbia University. And from that moment, we get the Babasaheb that we represent always. Almost every public image of him is in that suit. Now, if Columbia University is like this, they're not going to put it in a black neighborhood. Columbia University was in a white neighborhood, and Ambedkar had no experience with black people as is represented in, for example, Jabbar Patel's film, that he had this black friend who was washing dishes. All fiction. Ambedkar didn't have any interaction with the Harlem and this Harlem Renaissance and so on. That happened a decade after Ambedkar left. So everyone points to his exchange of letters with W.E.B. Du Bois, even Suraj. But that was in 1940. So the time he was in New York, he had no experience like this. On the contrary, about Gandhi, Ambedkar said that Gandhi claims that he suffered racial prejudice in South Africa, and he made this stupid remark that all Indians are untouchables in South Africa because of race prejudice. And he likened race prejudice to untouchability, which is ridiculous. Ambedkar said, the good thing about being in the West is that I have the privilege of experiencing race prejudice as opposed to untouchability. Because untouchability is so heinously difficult. Untouchability is something that is on the inside that has to be called out by the caste Hindu, which is why in Waiting for a Visa, every single chapter, he says, who are you? Who are you? Who are you? What is your caste, right? The caste Hindu, the casteist is always trying to call out the caste of the untouchable, because there's an unseen element of untouchability, whereas race is a seen thing. So Ambedkar says, race prejudice is actually, that I can deal with. It doesn't stop everywhere you go. It's quite transparent. Everybody knows. But untouchability is so insidious, and it's, everybody is secretly trying to find out who you are so that they can treat you in this way and so on. So what I wanted to discover then, the black civil rights experience was not what inspired Ambedkar in his New York years to translate his lived experience of untouchability in India into a civil struggle. Mahad was the first civil rights movement, as Anand Teltumde has rightly said. So where did that come from? And then fortunately I found out in a very inspiring way, because the Dalit assertion has largely been, I'm sorry if this is offensive, but has largely been misogynistic. There is a need for Dalit feminist assertion precisely because it is not always the case that the interests of the Dalit male is the same as the Dalit female. This is just an intersectional issue. So it was so inspiring to learn that the origin of Dr. Ambedkar's consciousness about translating a social struggle into a civil and political struggle was not the black civil rights movement, was the women's movement. At Columbia University, his supervisor, PhD supervisor, forced him to interact with a suffragist, a woman who was fighting for the right to vote. And he had numerous conversations with her, and I even point out that some of her writings, if you just change the word woman to untouchable, are identical to some of Ambedkar's very early writings. So he was taking Ambedkar, as a young Ambedkar, was taking inspiration from the women's movement. And that is something that I think is very empowering for the Dalit feminist movement today. That Ambedkar was a feminist, and he recognized in 1916 in New York that Brahmanism is essentially perpetuated through control of female sexuality. That's why Brahmanism is Brahminical patriarchy. You have caste because you control women's sexuality. And so this early insight of the women's suffrage movement on his conception of caste, it's not about purity and pollution, as sociologists say. It's about the control of women's sexuality. That should be a consistent understanding for all of us today, so that we can unite the overall Dalit movement with the interests of the intersection of Dalit women's movement. And this is why, this was one discovery I feel that really thrilled me, because, I have a story to tell my daughters also.
Yeah.
Can we take few questions?
Yeah, of course.
ಯಾರಾದರೂ ಕ್ವಶನ್ಸ್ ಕೇಳೋರಿದ್ರೆ ಒಂದು 2-3 ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ತಗೋತೀವಿ.
One question that I had when I was listening to you, as well as the fact that I was reading Sarita Ambedkar's writing and also Scott Stewart's, the depth and the details at which Ambedkar is now looked at, especially in Scott Stewart's writing, in the sense that you go into dig deep as to which color of markers are being used by Ambedkar. But unfortunately in the Indian writings you were actually pointing out to is the fact that we haven't thought of rereading Ambedkar in many different lenses. Why is it happening for people? Why is it that people like Scott Stewart are able to do it, but not our own Indian writers? Is there a difference from the academic backgrounds that they enter in from, or is it anything else?
So there are two sides to this. One, there is a very straightforward answer, which is the training that somebody like Scott Stroud receives, or I receive at foreign universities, compared to the training that is given in Indian universities. What people like Scott and I are hoping, in fact, also what we do with the royalties of the books, is that we put it in a fund for sending students from marginalized communities to study abroad in London and in US and so on. So that's where we try to help fix this situation which you have observed. So if people get trained in doing more systematic study, then of course the result will be more systematic research. But there is a very significant caste issue in this as well. It's not just Indian and foreign. You had mentioned, I think, 6, 7 books that have just come out. What do they all have in common?
So all of those writers have relied upon Khairmode and the Keer.
Yeah, of course. But there's one other thing that each of them have.
Most of them are foreign authors.
Yeah,
None
not a single one. And this is so one wants to celebrate the interest in Ambedkar. But when one understands that it has always been the strategy of the, how can we say, the Brahminical mind in a polite way, well, I said it in that way, it has always been the strategy to appropriate, to bring into yourself. Who was both government and opposition in West Bengal forever? Right? Every time I would visit Kolkata, I was so shocked that Mukherjee is a communist and Mukherjee is also a capitalist. So, it became very easy for us who recognize that to understand why a so-called communist state would immediately become a saffron state, because there's a pliability of their interests. And so the fact that all 7 of these recent books have been written by non-Dalits, people from outside of the community, seems a cause for celebration, but it's also a cause for great concern. So this is the area. It's not just Indian and foreign, it's the fact that the academia is dominated by one strata. And that domination is not only within the research area, it's also the publishers. You look at OUP, you look at all of that, top publishers, 90% of them are from this same strata. Now, why then are these 7 books by non-Dalits? Because this strata controls research and they control publication. And so the real issue is not so much the education, which I had started with, that, Scott and I and others have all received a much more rigorous education than is provided in Indian universities, but also what is happening in Indian universities is the prohibition of research in the first place. And if people manage to do this research, such as you all have managed, then the prohibition happens at the moment of publication. So this is also a conscious strategy to dominate even the Ambedkar intellectual space. And I have just one piece of evidence in case you think it's a conspiracy theory. Everybody knows that there's an Ambedkar chair at Columbia University instituted by the government of India 12 years back. Larian Rodriguez has just come out with a book about I think 10 years of Ambedkar chair speeches, inaugural speeches. All 10 of these are from that same strata. Okay, can I just say, is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay, they're all Brahmins. Ambedkar chair, Columbia University. Except for Gopal Guru. Okay, but even Gopal Guru considers himself a Brahmin. So what does this mean? This means that Columbia University has been duped, as it can always be, because Americans don't really have insight into what's going on here. Indian taxpayers, all of us, are funding this chair in Ambedkar Studies. The government of India gave Columbia University $10 million. You think Columbia University needs government of India's money? They don't need it. Why were they giving it? Because they know who's going to receive it, which is their crony, Brahmin, intellectuals who control Indian universities and Indian publishing. That's the Ambedkar chair. Now, 2 more years have passed since that time. Any Dalit has been there? You think there's not a competent Dalit in this country to hold the Ambedkar chair at Columbia University? Many competent people. But this is a system of systematic appropriation and systematic exclusion that operates at a level that is ideological, because everyone can always say, what do you mean there's casteism? Didn't we fund an Ambedkar chair? So I'm sorry I became very negative in this, but this is something that one, of course, my identity, I'm not a Dalit. So when I write a book that gets publicized by the publisher as the definitive edition, I feel very sad, because have I just excluded a Dalit writer from writing a biography because my publisher is announcing it as the definitive one? So one has to be very careful of what's going on in terms of what you mentioned.
I happened to read Ambedkar's letter to the University of Bonn, written in German. I was actually surprised that because I had until then known that Ambedkar took one course in German at Columbia, and having learned the language myself, I said someone who's taken one course could not have written such a letter. And it shows extraordinary ability. And do you know more about his interest in German, or are there other facets of his personality like this kind of extraordinary ability that he had that we don't know, we've not really heard of, or it's not that you hear of geniuses, but Ambedkar is a genius of a different magnitude, but we don't celebrate Ambedkar's genius as just, Ambedkar. I think it is so linked to it's reduced to just the Constitution and preamble for the larger audience, but because he has a different connect to the Dalit struggle. But here, that facets of his personality, if you could highlight, and if there are anything else.
Yes, it is interesting. I have gone to Germany to explore more about his time. He spent in the clinic there, so he had not only ability to write, which is exceptionally difficult, but also to speak. After only one semester. So more about this will come out in volume 2, which you'll find interesting. But there's one thing that I think we definitely neglect, which is what I was trying to capture here. So we know I'm drawing on him as a person, so there's a lot of mention of the family and the family life, as you had talked about. As an academic, as I mentioned, people often say that Ambedkar was a very good sociologist. What they don't recognize is that he invented sociology. That's a big difference, right? Because what is sociology in India? It's sociology of caste. He was the first person to undertake sociology of caste under the guidance of other anthropologists and sociologists who were doing not caste, but of course race and ethnicity. So even sociology, anyone here who's a student of sociology, you go back to the 19th century, what was sociology at that time? It was just kind of racialized study of the cranium and the size of the nose and the face and so on to see whether the colonized people were actually inferior to the white people and so on. Only at the turn of the century, with Boas, Ambedkar's professor, did sociology start to become not just justifications of racism and empire, but actual studies of community formation and so on. And right then, Ambedkar invents the sociology of caste in its contemporary form. So when we look at him, sometimes we think, oh, what a great academic and so on. No, he founded a discipline of academia. When we think of him as a lawyer, there are many books that are written about the prowess of certain lawyers and so on. And only Rohit Dey, I think, was the one to point out that he was not just any kind of lawyer. He was the first one in India to turn legal practice into social work. So this was another innovation that he did that we don't pay any attention to at all. So sometimes people find it very boring that I go through the case law of Ambedkar's different legal battles, but I think it's significant to point out how innovative he is. There's a moment when Jinnah is trying a case next in the Bombay High Court, and he's charging the issue is 2 lakhs, and Ambedkar is in the next room trying a case also for a Muslim, poor Muslim, and it's 24 lakhs. So what Ambedkar is doing is he's trying to turn law into a kind of social welfare, social upliftment. Then, as a social worker with his social welfare organizations, he begins various activities, introducing libraries. He thinks that this is something that we don't have. Introducing libraries in various He's introducing libraries. He's opening hostels. He's doing all of these pioneering strategies to get the untouchables educated, because he understands that their position is precisely because of a lack of education, and their lack of education is precisely what leads them into their enslavement and their exploitation. So, as a social worker, he's creating the infrastructures to allow the acquisition of knowledge. He's not going to a house and, how are you, let me help you, and so on. He creates the infrastructures to allow generations of acquisition of knowledge. So very radical. As an activist, of course, Mahad, with the Mahad struggle and so on, temple entry campaigns, public access campaigns. As Taltunde rightly points out in his Mahad book, this is really the first civil rights campaign of the 20th century. Because the Salt Satyagraha was a week, 10 days before, but that wasn't about civil rights, that was about political rights. Mahad was about social and civil rights. So it was the first one. So we talk about Martin Luther King and all of these things, but Ambedkar predated that by 30 years. And yet we don't talk about him as the starter of civil rights movement in the world. And then as a legislator, so the introduction of the legislation to protect workers, working hours, minimum pay, health and safety standards in the factory. He's not recognized for introducing these. The left appropriates all of that, but he was working independently. There are so many domains of his life. As you rightly point out, his intellect, he was a polymath. He was a master of innumerable disciplines: religion, politics, law, economics, philosophy, many, many disciplines. And he picked them up in a manner that ordinary people like you and I cannot even imagine. That was already one thing. But the fact that the intellectual was only one of the expressions within which he not only was competent, but innovative. Because in each of these domains, for me it's hard enough to be a lawyer and a philosopher. I struggle. I read philosophy, I forget the law. I read the law, I forget the law. Not only is he doing all of this, he's also engaged in social work and recreating what it can mean, institution rather than family. He's engaged in activism, and he's pioneering the model of civil rights. So, he did so many other things that have never been celebrated. and even explored. Is there a single book on Ambedkar's legal activism? Not one single book. I mean, there's a book collecting many of his cases, but the author of that book, or the editor of that book, just did a keyword search Ambedkar in LexisNexis, and every other Ambedkar who's ever practiced law also, his cases get mistakenly put into his. These are not Ambedkar's own cases, right? So, some attempt has been made, but nothing really systematic. Has there ever been, other than Teltumde's book, which is a masterpiece, has there ever been a book exploring Ambedkar as the founder of civil rights in the world? Nothing of this. So all of these aspects of his genius have yet to be explored, and they will be, but will they be done by the community? That's a deeper question.
I'm just a little curious to know. You said that Ambedkar developed sociology of class. Can you please elaborately explain what is the difference between the thesis of Homo hierarchicus, Louis Dumont, and Ambedkar understanding of class? Is there any difference between Dumont's thesis and the Ambedkar thesis on class?
So I like the fact that the book is written in a very popular kind of narrative style. I think because whether you talk about the Ambedkar's quote or his name, I think that is what really captures the popular imagination. I think the Ambedkarite politics is alive because of what is happening in popular imagination in India. And I also wanted to talk. I think Ambedkar was a journalist in Lupanayak and
Janata.
I think the way he writes in those editorials, they have a particular strategy and style that is very popular for me. And if you can elaborate on the editorials that he has written for West Bharat and Lupanayak and Janata.
In your talk, you spoke about the craft of writing, where you said you're consciously making an effort to reach out to the first generation learners. And you also spoke about Columbia chair being occupied by first strata. If you adopt this policy of reaching out to the first generation learners, won't you lose out on the academic center? How do you balance language, right, to remain relevant even in academic section and to be taken seriously even by the first generation? How do you strike this balance?
I'll go backwards. To be quite honest, I believe that most academicians are more or less hopeless. The ones who are already established and so on. They've made so many compromises and so on to get where they are. I think they might have lost their conscience, and that they're not really the important ones to grab, whose attention to grab. They are important in that they are teachers and they are spewing their orthodox ideology, but students often are smart enough to understand that they're being indoctrinated, and not always, but I think the first generation learners, the youngsters, are more important audience than the established academics. And another side to that, if I'm speaking personally, you see, if I were to advise a young PhD student, PhD scholar, I wouldn't advise her, target the first generation. No, especially if you're coming from marginal community. I do always advise young scholars from the marginal community how you break into the system, because there are many barriers to get you into that system. So I explain how to get in, what to work on, how to do it, how to get published, and all of that. But for somebody like me, I'm old now. I don't need to worry about those things myself. So for someone like me, targeting the first generation learners is a more important thing to do than the old academicians who I think really aren't going to change. We have to just wait for them to get get out. The global Ambedkar, this is very interesting because the phenomenon of India studies or social sciences and humanities within India, how it's perceived abroad, has been colored by the fact that from the 1960s, for example, I said my father was a professor at Columbia. He went in 68. Obviously, that means he's from a certain caste, right? In the 60s, only these privileged castes could travel. 70s, same thing. 80s, same thing. 90s, same thing. Only after reservation begins to produce a second generation of scholars who have the skills that can be used internationally, do we find any representation of marginal communities outside of India. Otherwise, for 4 or 5 decades, the perception of what India is has been controlled by the upper castes. And that's why the rest of the world is so enamored with Gandhi and have not even heard the name Ambedkar. Because you think that the Partha Chatterjees of the world and the Gayatri Chakravartis of the world, that they are going to be talking about Ambedkar? Well, yes, they are now, after 2004, because it's appropriation. Now they can profit off of Ambedkar, so they will mention him. But where, in 1984, when Partha Chatterjee writes The Nation, and in 10 years of subaltern studies, volume after volume, I mean, who is the subaltern par excellence? Obviously, it's the Dalit or the Adivasi or something. Dalit is not mentioned, 10 years of subaltern studies. Dalit is not mentioned. Ambedkar's name is not mentioned. 10 years of subaltern studies, 1984 to 1994 to 2000, 20 years. He's not mentioned in any book. Only in the 11th volume of subaltern studies does the Dalit get mentioned. Now, where are all these subaltern studies scholars? Columbia, Princeton, London, Oxford, Harvard, Duke. So basically what I'm trying to tell you is the understanding of India, social life of India, has been colored by the propaganda spewed out by the India's elite. And when India's elite speaks about the subaltern, they are quiet about their own role in marginalizing on the basis of caste because of their privileged identities. So, Ambedkar Studies has emerged in a context where the West has been deluded into thinking that Ambedkar is merely a modernist fighting a particular cause, which is not even in question anymore, because every one of my every one of my friends has told me, no, caste doesn't exist anymore. We don't practice caste. And they're not here to see it. There's a reason why Waiting for a Visa by Ambedkar, the first word of that book is foreigners. He says foreigners have some sense about untouchability, but they don't know what it really is. That was 1936. Nothing has changed in 2023. Foreigners don't know what's happening here because their access to information has been controlled by the dominant castes who have been, since the 1960s, going around spreading a myth that caste is not an issue in India. So Ambedkar Studies is unfortunately emerging in this environment. And when the subaltern studies groups and when the post-colonial theorists and when the sociologists from these dominant castes decided that there was money to be had in Ambedkar Studies, then suddenly they begin writing books about Ambedkar. So many books. In 2004, Partha Chatterjee publishes 3 articles on Ambedkar. But from 1984 to 2004, he didn't mention his name. So, it was a moment where they got the dollar signs in their eyes. Oh, there's something to be done. So right now, global studies, thanks to reservation and many now marginalized students who have gone abroad, now it is undergoing a battle for representation. Who has the right to speak and how do you speak about it? And Westerners are very confused. Last week I was teaching a course in Germany. I taught a 1-week course in Hamburg. And the vice chancellor of the university came to me and he says, we want to know more about Ambedkar. And I think we're going to invite this man named Bala Gangadhara from Ghent University. So right? So the man has good intentions, but he has no idea what's going on. So then I explained, I don't think you want a fascist to come to teach you about Ambedkar. So then, who should I call? So I gave a name of, many people here in India whom they can call. So there's a struggle going on at this moment, which is partly why I edited those 5 volumes. That was an attempt to give the world an understanding, a proper understanding of Ambedkar's view on justice, social justice, economic justice, legal justice, religious justice, cultural justice, so that this book was basically targeted to the international world, which is why it's unaffordable here in India. In order to help that effort of the marginal students who are out in Germany, in the UK, in the US, in Australia, trying to explain the true situation and trying to break through the 7 years, 60, 70, 80, 60 years of misinformation, disinformation given by the elite of India who have said there is no caste and Ambedkar is not important.
I think there's one question on the journalist.
Yes, as I was speaking about Ambedkar's genius, I completely left out his journalism, which he did for so many years, 30 years. He's writing these editorials which, as you rightly pointed out, have not been available till English, which is why I dedicate many chapters to English translations of his editorials, especially the ones that tell you about his character, because quite frankly, I look back, I said there were many overlaps, curious coincidences with my life in Ambedkar. Where there's no overlap at all is when I was the age that he's writing these editorials of such insight, power, I was, playing video games or something. So he was very precocious, and his editorials capture genius at a young age, really, really powerful. And not just genius. Genius is an abstraction. An understanding of social realities and how to articulate them in a way that common people can understand. And as you rightly pointed out, how Hindus can understand, how Dalits can understand, and how the British can understand. And his journalism has this triple function of educating the masses and educating the classes and educating the foreigners. And it's really spectacular. It's also a tragedy of how difficult it was for him to do. It was every press he opened failed, imploded because of financial difficulties, because of rivalry between editors and himself, and so on. But his work as a journalist, once again, we need a full volume covering Ambedkar as a journalist, because you could teach that at journalism school instead of, all of this other stuff that is always put out. And then a kind of academic question about homo hierarchy. So there are 2 fundamental distinctions. One is the nature of hierarchy. In Ambedkar is graded inequality, which is an internal complication of the hierarchies that Dumont mentioned. And 2, what Dumont is completely silent about is the role of female sexuality in the maintenance of graded inequalities. So in these ways, I think in these 2 insights, I think that Ambedkar is more significant a sociologist even than Dumont. Now, any sociologist, if I said that in an academic setting, they would all start attacking me and so on. But that's why those are not people to be bothered with. I think the insights of Ambedkar agreed. He postponed the second edition of Annihilation of Caste for years and years and years because he wanted to rewrite his caste, the genesis of caste in India paper from before. And then in Riddles in Hinduism, he also returns to caste in India. And in Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Ancient India, the unfinished books of Ambedkar from 1956, he's still talking about a paper that he wrote 40 years earlier. Now, why would someone whose thought and experience and insights evolved so much in those 40 years, why would he keep going back to that? Because he knows he discovered something that nobody else has discovered. So I think even he realized that the nature of sociology has neglected what he as a child actually discovered. And even today you read Uma Chakrabarti and others who plagiarize from Ambedkar, and they're silent. They'll say, his idea about surplus women is a very, backwards idea. But she's not grasping the significance of it, that women are the key to caste. And this is something that, what sociologist has said this other than feminist sociologists and Ambedkar a full century before? Sorry, how is that the case? The basic thesis is that what we call graded inequality or Brahmanism is a hierarchy where you have, let's say, 4 varnas in the simplified way: Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. And why even a Shudra doesn't want to destabilize this system? Because they have the outcast or the Dalit to tyrannize. What about Vaishya? Why they don't want to destabilize the system, even though they might be oppressed by the Brahmin and the Kshatriya? Because they have people to oppress in turn. Everyone who might have something to lose by Brahmanism has something to gain by Brahmanism. And the person, and this is not just based on Varna, it is also based on gender. So the Brahmin man gets to exploit the Brahmin woman. Kshatriya man gets to exploit the Kshatriya woman. Shudra man gets to exploit, and so on. The Dalit man gets to exploit the Dalit woman. So in this entire system, who is the only one who has nothing to gain? The Dalit woman. So the only one who has a motivation to topple the system is the most vulnerable of the system. And so the maintenance of caste, why it's lasted so many years, is because everyone gets to get something out of it. Everyone gets to exploit, except the most vulnerable person, the Dalit woman in this system. So the maintenance of the system depends upon ensuring that this person, the only one who has a natural motivation to totally annihilate caste, is suppressed, is kept in place. And that happens in all of the genders. Each one has someone to exploit by the control of female sexuality. So the maintenance of female sexuality is the key to the purity of caste. What do you do with a woman after marriage? It's called virilocality in sociology. She goes to the male's house, and then she is controlled by the mother-in-law, as we know. So the perpetuation of caste purity is all dependent. It's not on who you eat with. You remember commensality, as sociologists call it, eating together, was one of the first things to be broken. But what is the last thing to be broken? Intercaste relationships. And that's where rape comes in. And what is rape? The control of female sexuality. When you transgress what we have told you to obey, you will be heinously punished. You will be raped. You will be brutalized. You will be murdered. You will be humiliated. You will be paraded. And this is all in the control of female sexuality. Why must female sexuality be controlled? Because the entirety of the caste system depends on it. Even at the lowest sections, they can still exploit the women, and that is their benefit in this. Hence, women's sexuality is the key to caste.
There is one last question from the audience.
There's an interesting fact about the books collected in New York by Ambedkar. When he gets back from New York to Bombay, another ship sinks and then loses the book. But the interesting fact is that he tries to replace all the books he had collected in New York except those Marxist-related books. How did you find out that? This interesting fact. How did you delve into that? There's one more thing related to that. When you were studying in LSE, Harold Lasky was one of the famous political scientists, and we know Harold Lasky. At least I know because as a second-hand bookseller, I see a lot of books by Harold Lasky. But there's no relationship. Is there any relationship between Lasky and Ambedkar? Did you take any courses from him? Because there is no mention about it except for the revolutionary thing in one chapter.
Yes.
Yeah. Why was that? Because he was a Marxist thinker, he didn't get interested in Harold Lasky's lectures?
Okay. Yes, thank you. So 2 points. One, just access to all of his remaining books at Siddharth College, at Millen College, at Rajgruha, and in Symbiosis in Pune, and so on. So over the last 10 years, I have, like Scott Stroud, been able to see all of the books that exist that he owns, and that's where I noticed that many books he would replace, and many books, especially the books of Marx, he would not replace. But we should be clear about the time, because as the leader of the Labour Party, Ambedkar made many good faith efforts to cooperate with Marxists and socialists. So it wasn't until the 1930s that his opinion really began to sour about how they did not care about the untouchable laborer. They only wanted to exploit them for their own political ends. And so his distaste for communism comes after his experiences in London. So his lack of interaction with Lasky would not have been based on that. Ambedkar took many, many classes from Simkovich, a Marxist and communist in New York. So he would have happily taken classes from Lasky. Now, Valerian Rodriguez, in the Essential Writings, I believe, has mistakenly stated that Lasky was Ambedkar's teacher. To the best of my abilities in the LSE and the University of London archives and the British Museum, I find no possibility that Ambedkar took classes from Lasky. I've confirmed this with the archivist of LSE and of the University of London. Not that they are 100% reliable, what they say, but they do have records of Ambedkar studies, and they have records of Lasky's courses. And they do not, so I don't know why Valerian Rodriguez said that. I haven't asked him that question, but he made a mistake as far as I know, and Ambedkar never studied with Lasky.
We can wind up this session with my one question. So when can we expect the second part of this?
So the Ambedkar Jayanti 2024, we should have volume 2.